Sir Salman Rushdie is here. He is the author of 11 novels, 3 works of nonfiction, and a collection of short stories. On February 14, 1989, Valentine's Day, a religious edict, a fatwa, was issued against him by the Ayatollah Khomeini. The fatwa called for his death. Rushdie's book, The Satanic Verses, was accused of blasphemy against Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, and the Quran. He lived under the fatwa for 9 years. On September 24, 1998, Iran lifted the death threat against him. Now Rushdie has written a memoir about those dark years. It is called Joseph Anton. I'm pleased to have Salman Rushdie back at this table.
Thank you.
It is always good to have you at this table. Tell me about what you think is going on today about this movie.
I think, of course, this video of what may or may not be, we don't even know if the movie exists.
It's a trailer of a movie.
Yeah. I think obviously that was a flashpoint. I feel now, as we see it continuing, that it's more than that. I really don't think it's entirely about the movie anymore. I think unfortunately we live in an age of manufactured outrage. There's a kind of outrage industry where people deliberately pick things which they think can be used to incite large-scale violence.
And if it involved Muhammad, likely to.
And I mean, one of the reasons why in my book I use this metaphor of Hitchcock's movie The Birds is that I felt sometimes that what happened, I have felt very often actually, that what happened to me was a kind of prologue to a story which now engulfs all of us, the story of the rise of radical Islam and the ease with which it turns to violence, and the kind of language and rhetoric that it repeatedly uses, which is very hostile towards what one might very roughly call democracy. And I think if you could actually see pretty much a straight line connection between what happened back then in 1989 to this particular book and this particular writer and its authors and its translators and publishers. You could, through the 9/11 attacks, right up to the present day. Now we see the storm of the birds, And I felt often back in those days that one of the reasons why people reacted to what happened to me with a measure of bewilderment and confusion is that we had no frame of reference. We had no context to put an event like that in. It just seemed bizarre and kind of out of left field, and a kind of medieval attack being launched in the 20th century. And now I think we see a larger picture, and we begin to see how these things fit together into what is, after all, one of the major narratives of our time.
Somebody said that the film The Innocence of Muslims, which I think is the name of it, as I said, people have seen a trailer on the internet and don't know whether the film exists, would never have been made if you had been punished for the satanic verses.
You learn never to ask if questions. I think lots of stuff. The internet is full of stuff. If you want to find vilifications of more or less anything, any religion, it's there. You can find
anything
it.
Or anybody.
Anything or anybody, yeah. So the internet is like that. So if you're looking for material to get het up about, you will find it.
So that's the question. I mean, what are people who are prepared to latch onto something like this movie looking for?
They're looking for, unfortunately, I think, one of the phenomena of our time is the idea that people find their identity in their rage. People find their selfhood in terms of what they most object to.
And because it's larger than them, they find...
It becomes like a collective act of, by having an enemy, and by launching yourself in fury against that enemy, you seem to have a better feeling of who you are, and that's what happened in my case, that it becomes a kind of identity politics. People who are looking to find a narrowly defined but passionately, feverishly, even violently held definition of identity find it very easily by finding a target and attacking that target.
Is it about modernity at all?
It's something about that, and it's something about imbalances of wealth. Many of these countries, many of these young mostly men.
Mostly uneducated in many cases because they have not had the opportunity to.
And their prospects are kind of nil. You know, their chances of getting a decent job, raising a family, bringing it up, etc., in an ordinary way, are very low. And so that creates anger too. And it's very easy to turn that anger against the wealthiest bits of the world.
Has it touched you again?
Not really. I mean, every so often, you know, I mean, essentially for the last more than 10 years now, it's sort of been fine. And every so often somebody shakes a fist in my direction. You know, but at this point...
On the street or...
No.
I
mean politically. Politically, you know, usually coming out of Iran, somebody says something unpleasant. But at this point...
But there's been no action by the Iranian government at all because of this?
No, it's been essentially down to the odd rhetorical remark now for more than 10 years.
Why did you decide to write the memoir now?
Well, I just felt emotionally ready to do it, I think. I mean, I think I knew that I was going to do it. I always knew I was going to do it, which is why I kept a journal all those years to try and make sure that I remembered the detail, the sort of dailiness of it. But for a long time, I was absolutely not ready to write it. I didn't want to go back into that dark tunnel, having just come out of it. But, you know, the thing that happened to my life was that it sort of turned into a thriller. You know, it turned into a thriller/spy novel.
What's going to happen to him and the experience of hiding?
You know, and there were spies in it. There were secret policemen.
Right.
There were unknown refugees. There were international assassins. There was all this stuff that you normally come across in a certain kind of genre fiction, except that it really happened to me. Now, in retrospect, that's a good story to tell. At the time, it was no fun to live through. And I think I needed recovery time.
Here is a scene from a interview you and I did in 1992. I'll never forget how many cars I had to change before I arrived to see you to do this interview. This was 1992, I believe.
Yeah.
Roll tape, March 1992.
Most of us cannot imagine what it's like for you, and there are all kinds of important issues which we want to talk about. But give us a sense of the pain, the isolation, the looking over your shoulder,
Well, it was very bad at the beginning because it was as if, I mean, you have to imagine that every single procedure of your ordinary life is destroyed. I mean, that you can't go for a walk outside your front door, that you can't see your child, that you can't meet your friends, that every single thing that you would think of as the most trivial, ordinary thing suddenly becomes impossible. And that you're living in places which are not yours, which are, I mean, sometimes okay, I mean, sometimes very comfortable, sometimes very cramped, always very temporary.
Yeah. It's always the impersonality of the impersonal nature of a hotel room or somebody else's house.
Exactly, there's none of your stuff there. I mean, I'd left without any of my possessions. You know, I'd left literally in the clothes I stood up in. I then had to have somebody go into the house and get me some things out, you know, in the way of clothes, but which was done. But it meant, I mean, I still don't have with me 99% of my possessions. I haven't seen them for 3 years.
So here is the book, Joseph Anton, a memoir. Joseph Anton, the title?
Yeah, well, you know, there was a point when the police asked me to come up with a pseudonym, which was partly for practical reasons. It was partly, you know, I had to write checks. I had to be able to rent properties and a name that was not mine. But it was also so that they could train themselves not to accidentally use my real name if they were going for a walk around the block or something and just blow the cover of where I was. So they asked me to come up with a name. And they also said, don't make it an Indian name because too obvious, people can put two and two together, etc. So I was also asked to give up the ethnicity of my name, which is a tough thing to do. So I decided to retreat instead into literature, and I started trying out combinations of writers' names, and most of them were just ludicrous. But in the end, I came up with Conrad and Chekhov, so Joseph Conrad Anton Chekhov, and that became the name that was used for, I think, almost 11 years.
And you dedicate it to my children, Zafar and Milan, and their mothers, Clarissa and Elizabeth, and to everyone who helped.
Yes.
Who helped?
Well, that's, you know, I think one of the major subjects of this book and one of the great pleasures of writing it has been to be able to say who helped, because I mean, obviously, at the most obvious level, the police helped.
Yeah.
You know,
and we should make the point that the British government chose to help you because a foreign government had threatened one of their citizens.
Yes, it was because of a state attack.
Right.
You know, not because there were people who didn't like me.
Right,
It was because of a state-sponsored terrorist attack. I mean, they told me on the first day that they believed that there was a high probability that there would be a state-sponsored attack against me, and that's why I was being offered it. So yes, at the most obvious level, the British government, the intelligence services, the special branch, secret police. But beyond that, I mean, I think one of the great lessons that I drew from this whole event was the power of friendship, because I'm really lucky, I think, in that I was surrounded by a group of astonishingly loyal, courageous, principled people who went to amazing lengths to help me, sometimes moving out of their own homes so that I could live in them. And just in every sense, practical, emotional support, every kind of support a human being could wish in a kind of extreme situation. They gave me. I mean, I remember a friend of mine, Bill Buford, who was then editing Granta magazine in England, who afterwards worked at the New Yorker here. He said to me, I've never forgotten it, he said, your friends are going to form an iron ring around you and you'll be able to live inside it. And that's what they did. And remember, this is the kind of literary community, famously leaky, you know, incapable of keeping secrets, loving gossip above all things.
Yes.
And this was the community that absolutely shut its mouth, kept every secret, told nobody anything, and allowed me to have a kind of life for 10 or 11 years.
Yeah. But there were times in which you had to do things that must have said to you, am I doing the right thing? Hiding.
Yeah. It's very, I mean, I don't know.
Because it's humiliating.
It's humiliating. For me, that was a kind of overwhelming and repeated feeling, the feeling of being humiliated. You know, if you're in some kind of house that you've rented and something goes wrong, you know, there's a plumbing leak, you know, you have to call a plumber to the house. The plumber's not allowed to know that I'm there, so I have to kind of go and hide in another room. I mean, that kind of thing was demeaning and just made you feel sick.
There are also instances in which you have talked about in this book, the apology.
Yeah. Well, that was, I think, you know, I mean, I say it very openly in the book, I think, the stupidest thing I ever did. And all I can say in my defense is that, you know, I was reading through my journals for this, when I was writing this, and it became very clear, if you read the journals for that period, that the person writing them is not in a good mental shape. You know, I mean, I think I was probably in the most despairing condition that I've ever been in my life. There was a lot of external pressure on me, both through the media and from politicians.
It affects everything, your ability to write, your ability to feel good.
All of that, yeah. And there was a lot of people saying, you broke this, you fix it. You know, there was a lot of pressure on me of that kind. This is your fault. You need to find the solution to the problem. A lot of that. And when I was feeling in this very low state of mind, I allowed myself, essentially, I mean, I only blame myself, to be suckered into this encounter with some Islamic leaders who were promising me the world, you know, we'll fix everything, we'll get rid of it. And they had produced this document I was supposed to sign acknowledging the Muslim faith, you know, and I mean, I should never have signed it because I'm not religious, I never have been, but I did.
What's interesting, too, is what you now know about how the Ayatollah chose to issue the fatwa.
Yeah, I mean, he didn't know. I know for sure that he never saw a copy of the book, you know, let alone read a 600-page novel in English.
At his age and at the time that
he was really unwell.
Frail.
I mean, we know that what was happening in Iran at the time was that the revolution was in some trouble because of their Iraq war having not gone at all well. You know, and he was essentially looking for a way to rally the troops. And it was my bad luck to be Khomeini's last stand, I think.
And they visited him on his deathbed, really, when he was very ill.
Yeah, and got him and told him that there was this book that was against Islam. And, you know, he was a shrewd and wily old man, you know, and saw that this was something he could use to his advantage, and did. I mean, I've often thought that, you know, if the book had been published a year later or he had passed away 6 months earlier, something, I mean, we wouldn't be having this conversation and there would have been no need to write this book.
So there's the idea of hiding, which bothers you in retrospect. The idea of, in a sense, signing some kind of apology bothers you. What else?
Well, I mean, just the loss of 10 years of my life, you know, not being able to kick a football in the park with my son kind of thing. But I also felt that I learned a lot about myself, and that's a gain, if you like. I mean, I think...
what did you learn?
Well, after this moment that we've just discussed, this kind of rock bottom moment, I think it clarified something for me. You know, I think it just, my mind became clearer. And I thought after that, you know, I'm not going to be stupid like this anymore. I'm not going to try to make compromises on issues where there should be no compromise. I'm not going to apologize and appease, and I'm not going to try and, you know, tug the forelock and bend the knee. I'm just going to stand up for what I think is right, and I'm going to fight my corner, and if you don't like it, you don't like it.
Did you find people disappointed you?
Relatively few, you know. I mean, as I say, my main memory is of solidarity and friendship and love from people I knew. Yes, there were one or two moments when writers who I would have hoped would have been on my side ended up not being. Yeah. There were one or two moments when publishers would behave disappointingly, but, you know, relatively few.
Do you now put yourself in some place in the context of the history of literature because of what was at stake here?
Yes, I mean, I do. I mean, it's. I'm not saying this to glorify myself, but I think this was an unusually violent attack on the greatest principle of all, which is the principle of the freedom of speech, the principle without which all the other freedoms collapse. You know, the bedrock principle of a free society is the freedom of expression. And this was an assault on that freedom such as we've not experienced in a long time. And I think, you know, I mean, I try and work out at the end of the book whether this was a victory or a defeat. And I think at the end of the day, if you look at the narrow issue, the attack on that book and on its author and publishers, you know, we didn't do so badly. We stood up for the publication of the book. It's freely available. You know, there was an attempt to suppress the author, and he's sitting here talking to you.
And there were people who stepped forward who you did not necessarily know or know well.
Who came closer.
Who said, you're...
Well, one of which is your friend and mine, Christopher Hitchens.
Came forward and said,
yes,
there was a principle here.
Yeah, I had known Christopher a little, but he wasn't one of my close inner circle, but he became it. You know, he, as absolute choice, he stepped closer and closer to me and became, I mean, that's somebody you'd want on your side in a fight. You know, and I was lucky to have him.
At least you want to be representing you rhetorically.
Yeah.
What would you do differently?
I don't know. I've often asked myself that. I mean, one thing I think is, well, I would try not to make that appeasement mistake.
Exactly,
you know, I sometimes think I was wrong to accept the police instruction to not go home. You know. And I think the only reason I did was because initially we all thought this would be a very short duration. I mean, that's what the police thought it too. They said, it's, you know, it can't be allowed to stand that the head of state of one country orders the murder of the citizen of another country who's living in the country he's a citizen of and has committed no crime. You know, it can't be allowed. It's outrageous. So basically, I was told, let's just, you know, lie low for a few days, go and be quiet somewhere in the countryside. Let the diplomats do their work. Let the politicians do their work. It'll be fixed. Then all of us believed that this was a matter of a few days, and ended up being 11 years. But what I'm saying is that when I agreed with them that I should not go home for a few days, I thought I was agreeing to go home, not to go home for only a few days. In retrospect, I think I should have gone home and not gone on all these wanderings.
Did the world community of leaders come together for you?
You know, it slowly. I mean, one of the things I want to say about this thing is I think the victory of this thing that we defended was actually a victory of ordinary people. The people who really came together with extraordinary solidarity was the community of booksellers above all, and I think that was the front line. You know, that was where there were bombs and threats and menaces. And ordinary people, just the public, the reading public, I think there was enormous support from them, and they kept this case alive, and they kept the issues in people's minds. Eventually, politicians came on board. And I think one of the big moments, actually, was not long after President Clinton became president. There was a real shift of mood in Washington.
Right.
And I was able eventually to go and meet with him the day before Thanksgiving And when he was just about to go pardon his turkey, I squeezed in.
Said, "Pardon me, please."
Just before the
Let
turkey.
me pardon you.
Yeah, but I think the President of the United States making a statement of support was incredibly significant because it made a lot of other European allies who had been a bit kind of nervous. It sort of stiffened their spine, and it got them behind the case. And then the next thing that happened was the election of the Blair government. In particular, the fact that he put Robin Cook as Foreign Secretary.
Right.
And Robin Cook had a personal passion to get this sorted out. And suddenly there was a kind of energy there, which there hadn't been before. And I mean, he said to me, look, we're going to fix this. It can't stand. Leave it to me. It's going to be done. And so suddenly there was an energy in the British government supported by real support from the United States.
How about people in the Muslim community?
Well, one thing that's interesting is that during these years, there was a lot of support from Muslim writers and intellectuals. In fact, there was a book published here in Europe called For Rushdie, which was a collection of essays by 100 different Muslim writers, journalists, intellectuals in my defense. So there was a large attempt eventually by people who were not fanatics, to say that this is an important principle. And actually, in many cases, some of them even said it was a good book. So I'm grateful
I think
for
the
that.
surprising thing about this, I'm not sure how many people read the book.
Well, a lot of
that
people
felt
attacking it
motivated
did
by
not.
it,
Yeah, that's for sure. It was interesting also that 3 years ago, when it was the 20th anniversary of this threat, a lot of the people who were interviewed in England who had been part of the opposition to the book, and I think all of them said that it had been a mistake, that the attack on the novel had been a mistake. So, I mean, that's encouraging. Some of them even said so because they accepted the free speech argument. So,
Any Iranians?
No. This is with the Iranians. I think the most you can hope is that they just have other fish to fry.
You quote Conrad, who said, "I think I must live till I die."
Yes, it's one a character in one of his books says this, and it became like a motto for me, to keep going. And I think a thing that I'm proud of in those years is that I managed to continue with my work as a writer, and I wrote quite a lot of books, and I wrote a novel for my son, so a young adult novel, Haroon in the Sea of Stories. I wrote a collection of short stories, East West. I wrote 3 novels, The Moor's Last Sigh, The Ground Beneath Her Feet, Fury. All of that work was done during this very difficult time. And I also think, I set myself the task of trying to continue to be the writer I'd always been, not to succumb to fear and write scared little books, not to succumb to anger and write vengeful tracts. Go on down your road, I told myself.
The book is dedicated to your children. This is in part a book so they know the full story?
Yes, it is. I think, for instance, both of them have read it. I think they are both like it. I think both of them are a little weirded out by it. I think, having so much of their family story out there in public.
Yes, they've probably been weirded out by that.
Yeah. But, I think, for instance, my older son, Zafar, whose mother sadly passed away of cancer during this period, for him, I think it was very important to see this portrait of her.
Did you speak at her service?
Yes, I did. We were very close. All the way to the end of her life, and I spoke. Yes, I did.
When you look back and think about the implications of this and where it has come, you also think about your father, who didn't want you to be a writer.
Yes, what will I tell my friends, he said.
Yes. He wanted you to be a lawyer? What was it?
A lawyer, and also he had a textile factory, and he wanted me to help him run it, and so on. And I thought, I didn't see myself running a textile
Your mother
factory.
you described her as gossipy.
Yes, but I think it's often the case, certainly in Indian families, that the women are the keepers of the stories. So she knew all the stuff on everybody. So it was very good talking to her.
And what did Cambridge do for you?
Well, I loved being there, and I think it was a moment after I'd had an unhappy time at boarding school in England when I discovered, if you like, an England that I could and be a part of. And my father had been there before me, and I think it was important for him that I went. And I must say, one of the things I really loved doing in this book was to make the portrait of him that there is in the first 100 pages or so, because in fact, as I wrote it, it showed me more and more the extent to which I'm my father's son. You know, how much of his worldview, how many of his interests also shaped.
He died before
he died before the Satanic Verses was published.
But he lived to see you as a writer.
He lived to see, yes, Midnight's Children succeed and so on, and I think that was...
Did he say anything about it before he died?
You know, for a long time, he wouldn't talk to me about my work at all.
Why?
I don't know. He was like that. And then on my 40th birthday, which was just 5 months before he died, he wrote me a long letter in which he just talked about my work. And I suddenly realized that he'd thought very deeply about it, that it mattered a lot to him, and he understood it. You know, and it's an incredible letter to have received.
And what did it mean to you?
It meant everything. I mean, I carry it around with me everywhere I go. I always have it.
Now, what does it say?
It just, you know, he just talks about my work and just shows
that he was aware and participating and proud.
And proud of it, and just got it, you know, understood it.
Yeah. And your mom?
My mother always, you know, my mother was never, I mean, my mother read Midnight's Children and liked it, and she tended to like shorter things. So I mean, her favorite book of mine was book of short stories and a book of essays, so she could read little bits at a time. But yeah, I mean, she was, you know, I mean, they both.
It should be said that beyond the fact that an idea was a victim of this, the idea of freedom, and expression, and the role of writers in our life, in our civilization, all of that were attacked in this. Yes. But also, I guess it should be said that there were some other victims who lost their life because they were touched, connected.
Yes, I mean, you know, that's what I mean. It was a real threat, and unfortunately, some of the people who were at the sharp end of it were people who were more vulnerable than I because they were not protected as I was. So first,
go ahead.
Well, first, my Italian translator was attacked and stabbed and beaten, and fortunately survived. Then my Japanese translator was actually murdered at his university in an elevator. Clearly a professional hit. And then my Norwegian publisher was shot 3 times in the back, and I mean, should have died. Made a miraculous recovery.
So what's missing? I mean, some people will argue, as Kofi Annan did here with me, you know, it's a time for moderate Islam to speak out against those way on the extreme end, advocating radical, fundamental violence.
Yes.
And some say by doing so, you know, of not being true to the Quran.
Well, I mean, I just think...
So what's necessary to happen for people to somehow get beyond what is clearly, because I think Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world, you know, and much beyond the Arab world.
Yeah. There is a, you know, in my lifetime, there has been a growing intolerance inside Islam. I mean, not everybody, but a movement of intolerance. The Islam that I knew about as a boy in India was a very much more gentle, secularized, open thing. The rise of this new extremism, I mean, first of all, the people it most oppresses is other Muslims. You know, the Taliban oppressed the people of Afghanistan, you know. And I think that moment of this radical fervor needs to fade. It needs to be overcome. People need to move beyond
How will that happen?
From the inside. It's nothing.
That's what I said. The point, it has to come from the inside.
It has to come from the inside. There's no way it can be imposed from the outside.
Most religions have conflict within, tensions within, whether it's Protestant, whether it's, I know less about, say, Hindu and other religions like that, but there is a push and pull inside. Here in Christianity, there's a fundamentalist urge as well.
Well, I mean, you know, in Islam, there's a Sunni-Shia conflict, of course.
That's right. There's a Sunni-Shia, which has to do with the beginnings.
But mainly, it's this question of sensitivity, a refusal to allow the core subject of the religion, you know, the birth of the religion, the life of the Prophet, etc., to be questioned. And it seems to me this is a battle we've had before. The writers of the European Enlightenment, out of whose ideas comes the American Constitution, amongst other things, you know, they knew that their fight was not with the state, it was with the church. In those days, it was the church which had inquisitions, anathemas, excommunications, etc., all kinds of weapons by which it tried to limit what could be discussed and not discussed. And those great writers, Voltaire, Diderot, Montesquieu, Rousseau, they knew that in order to create freedom of expression, they had to overcome the power of the church to set limiting points on thought. And that's what we owe them, that they won that battle. Now we find the same battle in another religion.
Your father was, in some way, was he an Islamic scholar in some ways?
He, much more so than I. I mean, let's say he could speak and read classical Arabic and Persian, and he studied at university and so on. So he was much more scholarly than I.
And in fact, I think the largest majority of Muslims outside of in India is one of the largest populations of.
Yeah, I mean, India is, there's more Muslims in India than in Pakistan. Yeah. Interestingly, I mean, I think Indonesia is the biggest country, but yes, but in our family we weren't religious. I mean, see, my immediate family, my parents and I, they weren't religious. But I mean, in my larger family, there were many believing Muslims. I mean, my mother's father, my grandfather, was a deeply religious man, and he went on the pilgrimage to Mecca and so on. But he was also.
And what did they go through when you were going through this?
Well, some of them were supportive and some of them weren't. Really? Some of them weren't.
You said that every book has to teach you how to write it. How did this book teach you how to write it?
Well, I wanted to, the thing about writing this book, I felt I didn't want to write it like a confessional. I didn't want to write it like a diary. In the end, I thought, I want to write it like a novel. I want to write it like a novel because it is kind of, as we were saying, it's got elements of thriller and spy novel. And I want to write it like a novel, except that everything's true. So I thought about these great non-fiction novels, like Truman Capote's In Cold Blood, or Schindler's List, or The Right Stuff. These books where the authors have used novelistic skills of character and language and to shape a true life event. And I thought I wanted to do that too, except the difference is that this time, I mean, I'm writing about my story. They weren't writing about their own story. And that's one of the reasons for pushing it into the third person.
I was going to ask that.
Yeah. Because I wanted it to feel like the character with my name is a character like all the other characters and not separated out, so that I could treat all of them alike. I thought one of the going-in positions is you've got to be rougher on yourself than anyone else, because otherwise the book reads like making excuses, and nobody wants to read hundreds of pages of somebody making excuses for their life.
Or to sound like they're whining.
Yeah, exactly. So that third person just allowed me, as the writer, to take one step sideways from me, the character in the story, and be, I think, more objective about him. To say, yeah, there are things he did wrong, there are things he wished he hadn't done, and to talk about him, me, with that objectivity.
Beyond the loss of the time, in terms of your life would have been different if you had not had to live it the way you did.
Yeah.
How do you look back on it in terms of what has added to your life?
Well, it's, as I say, I'm much clearer about what I believe, what I stand for.
Yes, exactly. If you ask the lessons, that's what you say. You're much clearer. But I mean, did it make you more human? Did it make you more?
Well, to use the cliche, "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger,"
right.
and I think that cliche is probably true. But I also worried, and this is one of the reasons also for doing the book the way I did, that something happened to me where, by my enemies, I was demonized. And by my supporters, I was sometimes idealized.
Lionized.
Or turned into this kind of iconic figure.
Right.
And I didn't feel either like that demon or like that idealized figure. I felt like a human being somewhere in the middle, like we all are. Messy, confused, complicated, contradictory, sometimes managing to do something worth doing, sometimes misstepping, etc. And I thought I want to try and restore the idea of humanity to this story, not to have these sloganized versions of me, but to say it's just a man.
And make it more real.
Yeah, it's just a man going through an extraordinary crisis.
The book is called Joseph Anton, for reasons we have described. Salman Rushdie, thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Back in a moment. Stay with us.